All right, so chapter 17 is about human health and environmental risk, and it starts, the first half is about different kinds of diseases. So for this slide, we have a little bit about some environmental health risk and environmental diseases that have affected Lake Apopka, and if you would like to look at any of this PowerPoint will be posted on the website so you can look at these and understand some environmental health issues that have been facing Florida. But first, let's talk about the different kinds of risks. There's three different types of risks. There's physical, biological, and chemical. Physical is environmental factors such as natural disasters, but it can also include things like sunburn or exposure to radiation. Biological risks are usually in the form of diseases. So diseases are anything that impairs the function of the body with a characteristic set of symptoms. And then there's chemical risks, which are associated with exposure to chemicals from either natural chemicals or anthropogenic chemicals. So this chapter focuses primarily on biological risks and then chemical risks. That's what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about biological risks first. There's one example of biological risk is infectious diseases, which are diseases caused by agents known as pathogens. So in this example over here, we have animal disease transmission, just kind of a general diagram showing animal disease transmission. This is one for hookworms or roundworms, which can be present in our pets that can be in soil or sand, especially in the feces of the animals. If the child plays in the sand, which is contaminated by fecal matter, the disease may be transmitted. Some examples include pneumonia and venereal diseases as well. So out of all these kind of biological diseases or infectious diseases make up 26% of death caused by disease. And among these infectious diseases, 94% is just caused by 6 different types of diseases. So respiratory infections, HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, and malaria. So we can take these diseases and divide them into 2 categories. We have chronic disease and we have acute disease. Chronic disease slowly impairs the function of a person's body. Some examples could include heart disease and most cancer. Acute diseases are diseases that rapidly impair the functioning of a person's body. So these diseases could be things like the Ebola hemorrhagic fever, and we're going to discuss later, and death can come either in a matter of days or a matter of weeks. So low-income countries or developing nations tend to have different risks associated or different diseases that lead to death. The leading risks in low-income places are, and low-income nations are poor nutrition and poor sanitation. However, high-income risks in developed nations have a different set of risks that lead to the most amount of deaths. This includes things like tobacco use, inactivity, obesity, and then urban air pollution. So as you can see, depending on where you are on the planet or what country you're in, the different types of risks change as a country goes through demographic transition. Another way to visualize this is to divide those two into modern risks and traditional risks. And as a country is going through demographic transition, earlier in their development, they are at high risk of what we call traditional risk of poor nutrition. And then over time, modern risks become more prevalent, the diseases associated with obesity, inactivity, and so forth. So as you can see, over time, modern risk increases as traditional risks decrease. All right, so these diseases, infectious diseases, can be divided into further categories into historical diseases and emergent diseases. So let's talk a little bit about historical diseases. And before we get into that, let's talk about the difference, or what the terms epidemic and pandemic mean. So when a pathogen causes a rapid increase in a disease, we call that an epidemic. And when an epidemic occurs over a large geographic region, such as a continent, we call that a pandemic. So some of the common diseases, historical diseases, include things like plague, malaria, and tuberculosis. Let's talk about plague, or the Black Death, first. Plague is estimated to have killed hundreds of millions of people throughout history, and it included nearly one-fourth of the European population in the 1300s. Today, there is still an occasional small outbreak of plague around the world, including in the southwestern United States. However, modern antibiotics are highly effective at killing the bacterium that is the pathogen for the disease, and that tends to prevent human death. There's malaria. Malaria is caused by an infection from any one of the several species of protist in the genus Plasmodium. This parasite spends one stage of its life inside a mosquito and another stage of its life inside of a human. So the mosquito is not the pathogen of malaria. Mosquito is what we would call a vector of the disease. It carries the disease pathogen, in this case a protist. So infections in humans are recurrent flu-like symptoms, and each year 350 to 500 million people in the world contract the disease, and 1 million people, mostly children under the age of 5, die from malaria. Another historical disease that you should be familiar with is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a highly contagious disease caused by a bacteria. This bacteria primarily infects the lungs, and it is spread when a person coughs and expels the bacteria in the air. And what makes this bacteria so scary is that it can persist in the air for several hours and infect a person who inhales them. As is the case with many pathogens, a person can be infected with this bacteria, but not develop the disease itself, not show any of the symptoms. So it is estimated that 1/3 of the world's population is actually infected with tuberculosis, even though not all of those infected show any symptoms, but they are carriers of the disease. So now that we've talked a little bit about historical diseases, let's talk a little bit about what's called emergent infectious diseases. So in recent decades, we have witnessed the appearance of emergent infectious diseases, which are defined as infectious diseases that were previously not described or not common in the past 20 years. So some of these diseases, usually when an emergent infective disease comes onto the scene, it makes the news. Things like H5N1 bird flu, mad cow disease you might have heard of, West Nile virus, Ebola hemorrhagic fever, cholera. These are all diseases that flared up, maybe not cholera, but a lot of these diseases have flared up in the last 20 years. So let's talk a little bit about them. So HIV was sort of became more prevalent during the 1970s. It stands for human immunodeficiency virus, and it leads to the disease called acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. In 1983, scientists discovered that the weak immune system was caused by the HIV virus, and that this virus is spread through both sexual contact and by drug users who were sharing needles that had not been sanitized. Today, AIDS is still an issue, and today more than 33 million people in the world are infected with HIV, and 25 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses. Drugs to treat the symptoms of AIDS do tend to extend life, but unfortunately, many of these drugs are very expensive and not affordable for people living in low-income countries. So if you acquire AIDS in the U.S. And you can afford the proper medicine, you can tend to live for long periods of time. However, if you contract HIV in a developing country and can't afford the diseases, or don't have or can't afford the medicine or have access to medicine, a lot of times it is very deadly. Another is Ebola, Ebola hemorrhagic fever, which was first discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo near the Ebola River. And usually once contracted, death occurs within 2 weeks, and there are no drugs available to fight the virus. In fact, recently in a country in Africa, the Ebola virus has cropped up again. So this is a very scary disease, considering the fact that we have no drugs that are able to treat it. Mad cow disease is a disease that affects the central nervous system of of a cow, and it's caused by some proteins called prions that mutate into deadly proteins and act as pathogens that cause the mad cow disease. There is some concern that these prions can be transmitted to humans through the non-proper cooking of cow meat. Um, but as it's flared up in Britain, after it flared up, a total of 180,000 cattle were affected. 166 people died as of 2009. Now the cattle has been banned. We monitor it more, and now the risk has been greatly reduced. There's also bird flu, H1N1. It's been largely regulated to avian species, but in 2009 it had made the jump to humans, and in 2009 400 people became infected by H5N1 and more than half of them died. Currently, the H5N1 virus is not easily passed among people, but if a future mutation makes transmission easier, scientists have estimated that it has the potential to kill 150 million people, which is kind of scary. And then, last but not least, is West Nile virus. It's transmitted by mosquitoes. It can be highly lethal in birds, blue jays, crows, and robins. Most species of birds survive the infection. It has made the jump to humans. The first case was identified in 1937, but in 1999 the virus appeared in New York and spread quickly throughout much of the United States. The highest number of deaths from the virus occurred in 2002 and 2003. Efforts to combat mosquito populations to protect against mosquito bites are causing a decline in the disease, as we can see in this graph. All right. Last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical risks. Chemical risks is also known as the study of chemical risk is also known as toxicology, and these are terms you've probably heard before. Some of them might be new. So neurotoxins are any chemicals that disrupt the nervous system. Carcinogens are any chemicals that cause cancer. Tetragens are chemicals that interfere with the normal development of embryos or fetuses. Allergens are chemicals that cause allergic reactions, and endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with the normal functioning of hormones in an animal's body. So to find out where some chemicals are of major concern, get table 17.1 in your book, page 472. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But next, we'll watch a little video on hormone mimicry, and we'll call it a day.
Estrogen is a hormone produced naturally in the body that plays an essential role in growth and development throughout life. Although primarily produced in females, estrogen is also produced in males to a lesser extent. Estrogen functions with a receptor like a lock and key to deliver a message to the body. Estrogen exposure also comes from molecules that are structurally different from estrogen but mimic its biological functions. These estrogen mimics function by the same lock and key mechanism by fitting into the receptor so the same message is sent to the body. Estrogen mimics can be found in many products we use every day. Birth control and hormone replacement therapy often contain synthetic estrogen. Atrazine is a commonly used herbicide that mimics estrogen. Bisphenol A is an estrogen mimic used in the polycarbonate plastics that make up many of our food and water containers. Triclosan is a major ingredient in antibacterial soap that is also an estrogen mimic. These estrogens enter waterways after being passed through human and animal excretions, rinsed down drains, or rinsed directly onto the ground where they proceed to seep into the water. Pollution by estrogens was not known to be a problem when our wastewater treatment facilities were designed many years ago. Currently, the technology to remove estrogens from the water at the wastewater treatment facility is not available, so the levels of estrogens continue to rise as the hormones cycle through our water systems. Fish and frog populations are collapsing from overexposure to estrogens. Some of the adverse effects of this exposure include the feminization of males, delayed sexual maturity, decreased size of male reproductive anatomy, and thinner eggs. Although data on the estrogen levels in the lower Chippewa River Basin have not been collected, similar effects have been seen in fish in the Mississippi River and the boundary waters in northern Minnesota. Fortunately, we have not yet seen this feminization in men and boys. However, too much estrogen exposure is correlated with many other health issues in humans, such as increased rates of heart disease, stroke, breast cancer, uterine cancer, and prostate cancer, as well as decreased muscle mass and sperm count. There are many ways you can help limit the estrogen levels in the lower Chippewa River Basin. First, do not flush birth control down the drain. It contains synthetic estrogen. Avoid the use of pesticides and herbicides. They contain atrazine. Use aluminum or stainless steel water bottles over plastic bottles. They contain bisphenol A. And finally, do not use antibacterial soaps. They contain triclosan. Research has shown that regular soaps without the antibacterial ingredients work just as well for regular household use.
All right, so that just about does it. Please make sure you watch this and be prepared for a quiz on Tuesday. Have a wonderful weekend.